Hi, everyone, and welcome. As Luke said, my name is Hannah Swan, and I am the archivist for the University of Wisconsin-Madison School of Pharmacy, where I manage the collections of the American Institute of the History of Pharmacy. And this is Come On In, The Water's Fine, A Brief History of Healing Spas and Medical Tourism. This is a new version of a talk that I first gave at the Ephemera Society of America's annual conference in March of this year. So before I begin, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that I present to you today from Dejop, the ancestral lands of the Ho-Chunk Nation, who have stewarded and continue to steward this land and its natural resources in spite of attempts at erasure by white settlers. It is particularly important for me to make this acknowledgement as my presentation focuses in large part on the mineral springs of the Americas, almost all of which have or have historically had sacred meaning to their local indigenous tribes. And before we get into the kind of meat of the presentation, I should introduce the collections of the AIHP, from which almost all of the items you will see featured today come. I do suspect, though, that most of you who are attending today are very familiar. The archival and print collections of the Institute total about 1,500 linear feet of materials, most of which are ephemera. They document the history of pharmacy and pharmaceuticals from the 19th century through to the 21st century, and the collection spans topics ranging from psychedelic medicine to retail pharmacy design to patent medicines, medicine shows, and general quackery. The Institute also supports scholarship in the history of pharmacy through community outreach, programming, and grants and awards. So today, I'll be focusing on the collection of materials related to spa towns and mineral waters at the AIHP, which serves as a record of the shift from the spa resort as serious medical establishment to the spa as sophisticated vacation activity in the period from the mid-19th century through to the early 20th century. The advertising ephemera in the collection materially represent this shift using text, illustration, and bibliographic design to emphasize the interplay of medicine and leisure. In my presentation, I will begin with a brief history of the water cure up to the 1800s, followed by a discussion of European spas as prototypes for the American context. I will then move into the referential advertising strategies of American cures, before finally discussing bottled mineral waters and how labeling laws affected the mineral water tourism industry. So if you'll pardon just one water-based pun before we dive in to the rest of the presentation, I think it's important to contextualize the materials with a bit of background on early water cures. So as I mentioned, our collections here at the Institute don't generally go back further than the 19th century, meaning I don't have any ephemera to directly illustrate ancient water cures and heroic medicine per se. But we will start over here on the right with one of the most well-known water cure establishments in the world, Bath, England, for a whirlwind tour of about 10,000 years of bathing culture history in approximately 2 minutes. So there's no real beginning to the history of humanity's use of mineral springs, in so much as it's been going on since time immemorial and across cultures on all continents, excepting perhaps Antarctica. At Bath, England, the earliest use of the waters was roughly 10,000 years ago by Paleolithic hunters. Around the world, mineral springs were often considered sacred and were used by local communities as medicine, as gathering space, and as ritual purification. Both the Greeks and Romans esteemed bathing, though they differed in their approaches. The Greeks tended to view cold water as more curative, while the Romans leaned towards the benefits of soaking in hot water. The city of Bath, England, was founded in the 1st century CE by the Romans, who built extravagant bathhouses within which they would take the waters. Though it's a bit strange to think of Romans going on holiday, scholars often point to Augustan Rome, which is about 44 BCE to 69 CE, as the birth of modern tourism, centered on a change of air and visiting mineral springs for health. They even had travel guidebooks. Moving forward in time, during the Middle Ages, mineral springs remained popular with rich Europeans, who were the few able to afford to travel to visit them. However, public bathhouses began to get a seamy reputation as hotspots for sex work and as such for sexually transmitted diseases. This eventually led to the almost total suppression of public baths in England by Henry VIII in the early 1500s, a ban which would last until the mid-17th century. As an interesting side note, the word stew was often used to describe public baths, and although it originally referred to stewing in a hot bath, it became increasingly affiliated with a house of ill repute until stew became a synonym for brothel. Unfortunately, I don't have time to get into the nitty-gritty of the period from 1400 to 1800, but what you mostly need to know is that personal bathing all but disappears in the West. The general idea seems to have been that disease came in through your pores, so you should maintain a healthy level of grime to keep it out. Instead, bathing begins to emerge in what is known as heroic medicine. Heroic medicine is tied to the humors, the idea that you have 4 humors in your body: black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood, and you get sick when they are out of balance. Treatment revolved around the rebalancing of these humors through things like bloodletting, purging, and hot and cold bathing. Even up to the mid-19th century, many Americans didn't regularly bathe themselves, and when they did, they often didn't get fully wet. I've reproduced here on the left a 1902 ad for splendid moneymakers for hustling wide-awake druggists to show that even in the early 20th century, there would still be a need for a folding water bath, which you could use, filled by either tap or by bucket, and then fold away when not needed. So moving forward through time, we'll stop in the mid-19th century to discuss the birth of the American water cure and its connections to contemporary reform movements. All the images you see here were taken from a volume of issues of the Water Cure Journal from 1855, which I consulted at Ebling Library, the Health Sciences Library at UW-Madison. In the early 19th century, an idea began to spread that maybe illness was brought down on you as punishment for your moral transgressions, what was eventually called hygienic religion or medical sectarianism. Moral and spiritual purists began to call for piety, temperance, sexual abstinence, and certain dietary restrictions. The idea that living a pure, natural life would lead to spiritual perfection. As a whole, these ideas joined to be known as the Reform movement. Beyond health, reformers also backed sociopolitical movements such as suffrage, abolition, prison reform, and labor law reform. As you see here in the middle, this included dress reform for women, with supporters calling for rational dress, such as bloomers, and the eradication of corset use. It wasn't all progressive social movements, however. Reformers also had deep ties to phrenology, which went hand in hand with eugenics and ideas of racial purity. The publishers of the Water Cure Journal were, in fact, Fowler and Wells, arguably the most famous phrenologists in New York in the 19th century. For our purposes, the most important part of the reform movement was the establishment of the so-called water cure for health. Though sometimes attached to a mineral spring, the main requirement for a water cure establishment was that it be in a rural location where reformers could come cure their ailments with water. This included drinking large amounts of water, as many as 20 glasses per day, taking cold baths, various douches, internal and external, cold water enemas, which were meant to tone the intestines, localized bandaging with wet compresses, and my personal favorite, being tightly wrapped in a cold, wet sheet, then wrapped in wool blankets and being left to shiver for several hours until the patient's temperature normalized and they began to sweat. These cures were used to treat everything from paralysis to typhoid to excessive masturbation. The pharmacy historians in the audience may get a kick out of the new patent medicine advertisement here on the right, a water-themed spoof of a patent medicine advertising poem. So as I mentioned earlier, scholars believe that the first real tourism in the West emerged in ancient Rome, where wealthy Romans would travel to mineral springs to take the waters. By the 19th century, the water-based tourism industry was well established in Europe, with large resorts blossoming around the natural sources. And indeed, our use of the word spa actually comes from the Belgian town that became so famous for its waters as to become eponymous with the institution. Spa also counts among the 11 great spa towns of Europe, a UNESCO World Heritage designation. The others are Baden-Baden in Austria, Vichy in France, the city of Bath in the UK, Montecatini Terme in Italy, Baden-Baden, Bad Kissingen, and Bad Ems, all in Germany, and Karlovy Vary or Carlsbad, Marianskaya Lasnia or Marienbad, and Františkovi Lasnia or Franzensbad, all in modern-day Czechia. And you can see all of them here on the map. Looking at European spas, we'll begin with this booklet published for the spring at Vital in the Département of Vosges in France. It's got this lovely embossed cover and halftone photos on the interior, and we can tell that this is a high-end booklet from those details, as well as the fact that the booklet is actually bound rather than stapled, as you can see here, and here as well along the spine. This view here also gives us a really nice look at the embossing on the inside of the front cover. So this booklet was published for the 1910 season, likely both as advertisement, given that it includes pricing and logistical details, and as souvenir, given the extensive illustrations and the undoubted cost of printing and binding. There's a great photograph of the casino here next to this very poetic description of why the spa's location has made it a success. In Vital, we are made to understand patrons will never, quote, feel the humidity or dampness of institutions situated in narrow valleys, nor the disagreeable emanations of those located in the centers of towns. And then at the very bottom here, we have a testimonial from the quote unquote famous Professor Landouzy, who it turns out was a neurologist from Rheims. He writes that there is no village or town to disturb the beauty of Vital, adding that, quote, if I have noted this, it is not for the love of the countryside, nor a love of the picturesque, but because this scenery is part of the combination therapies that are dear to me, and because those who want tranquility, calm, and rest will find them here and in the maximum comfort possible, end quote. And I will note here that these are my own admittedly imperfect and at times abbreviated translations. So taken together, we see the water cure establishment emerge as a specifically geographically bounded phenomenon. The spa town had to exist elsewhere, away from the disagreeable emanations of city life. This both plays into the economics of the spa town, which relied as much upon the hotels and casinos as it did upon the fees to take the waters, and into the modernist anxieties about the city that took root during the late 19th century. The question of air particularly harkens back to miasma theory, the belief that disease was spread through miasma or bad air. And if you'd like to learn more about this, highly recommend Stephen Johnson's book, The Ghost Map. Playing on fears of the stress and unsanitary conditions of the city, Landouzy and the publishers of the Vital booklet depict the water cure establishment as an Edenic return to nature, where patrons can escape the ills of society to be cured of their specifically modern ailments. And here we have a few more pages from the same Vital booklet, which I reproduced to really give you a sense of the luxury of these resorts. So in contrast to the opening focus on nature and the tranquility of the locale, we now have a detailed breakdown of all the activities and amenities available to the city dweller taking the waters. Because in the end, as much as the water cure establishment was intended as an escape from the ills of modernism, it still had to cater to the high society set by replicating existing social structures and the comforts of home. So for recreation, there's a casino, game halls, lecture halls, billiards rooms, a ballroom, a theater, tennis courts, concert halls, a golf course, riding stables, a racetrack, croquet and pétanque on the lawn, donkey rides through the countryside, a Catholic church and an Anglican church, and to top it all off, les petits chevaux, which I can only take to mean miniature horses. So you can see the ways in which something supposedly intended to be a medical treatment morphs into this landscape of pleasure, filled with so many activities that guests would no doubt feel obligated to stay for weeks or even months. And indeed, you can see they're talking about, not a week, but the season of 1910, which is presumably May 25th to September 25th per the practical information section. Most of this was spent hobnobbing with the other elites. And in case you weren't sure if it was elite enough for you, they actually list the important guests of the season who will be making their way to Vitel, including politicians, princes, dukes, and counts. And we also have this pretty amazing international list of doctors who were visiting during the 1910 season, coming from locales as diverse as Tunisia, Algeria, Brazil, Portugal, and Greece. So taken together, we can see how the austere water cure establishment of the reform movement in America, with its shivering and cold water enemas, is contrasted with this bastion of sophistication and pleasure. And while the ideas of natural purity remain, they're being used more to treat the quote unquote disease of modern living than, say, a disease like typhoid. So moving on, this booklet is from one of the oldest water cure establishments in Europe, Val-les-Bains in the province of Ardèche in France. So the story goes that in 1602, a fisherman, whose name was either Pierre or Martin, seemingly depending on whom you ask, discovered after a flood that drinking water that was contaminated by the spring at Val cured him of his kidney stones. Val-les-Bains is a good example of the shift in medical spas during the 19th century. Though the mineral waters were bottled and sold starting in the 17th century, it actually wasn't until 1851 that any kind of facility was built on the premises to allow the internal and external taking of the waters. And we can see with this ephemeron right away from the tone of the paper, the printer's ornaments, and the overall print quality that this is a cheaper booklet than that which was published for Vitel. There are neither photographs nor illustrations. The text block is very basic. It's not stylized like the Vitel booklet. And this is likely to do with the intended audience. So whereas the Vitel publication gave specific details of the 1910 season, including costs, expected guests of honor, and the raft of leisure activities on offer, this booklet advertising Val-les-Bains is much more austere, much more focused on the actual health benefits of the springs. It's hard to say without comparing this to other ephemera advertising Val-les-Bains from the same period, but my assumption is that this is either intended for doctors or pharmacists who might prescribe a trip to the spa to their patients, or that it is intended for medical visitors to the spa as a breakdown of what effects they can expect. It is certainly not intended to be kept as a souvenir of the visit, considering that it has no visual representations of the spa facilities. However, you can see here on the right that we do see that they've noted that the rail station at Val is well organized, the countryside is picturesque and easily accessible. They're also advertising the casino and the Grand Hôtel des Bains, and the consumer is told that, quote, the hotel is of the first order, newly furnished, and that it has electric lights. So obviously there is a touristic element here. It just isn't centered in the way it is in the Vitel advertisement. Next, we'll move on to Vichy water. So Vichy water remains one of the most famous mineral waters globally. And this advertising booklet was prepared for the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893 and uses the rich imagery of the Vichy resort establishment to sell the water to American consumers who would likely never see the real thing. We can note that the booklet is published in English rather than in French. There are no rolling hills or floral ornaments to be found, overshadowed by images of the casino, the springs, the boulevard, and the Grand Hotel on site. The promenade boulevards were a key feature of European spa towns, intended to promote therapeutic walks in addition to the internal and external taking of the waters. They also bring the modernity of the late 19th century city into the spa. Arguably the most famous European boulevards are those constructed by Georges-Eugène Haussmann in Paris at the behest of Napoleon III. Unsurprising then that Napoleon III was intimately involved with the construction of the spa town of Vichy, which is, if you'll remember, one of our great spa towns of Europe. Key to the modernity of the boulevard was the public gaze. So the boulevard was meant to be strolled not only for relaxation, but also to see and be seen by other pedestrians. We see this societal aspect in this illustration of the casino, where the various patrons are shown dressed up in their finest and looking at one another as they stroll through the grounds. This again connects back to the idea of the spa as being a high society activity. This all, again, connects to the shifting identity of spa towns over the course of the 19th century. Rather than an emphasis on the healing powers of the springs, exemplified by their situatedness in nature, there is instead an emphasis on the material wealth and development of the resort at Vichy. So I'm not going to spend too much time here, as I do want to move forward into my discussion of the American context, but I want to take a moment both to show off some more collection materials and to kind of further underline how this tension between the natural water cure and the sophisticated high society spa plays out in these ephemera. So as is common to many pieces of advertising ephemera, regardless of product, here we have an image of the manufactory, in this case, the bottling plant, on the back of cover of this booklet advertising Kronthal spring water. Despite the industrial imagery, you still have this situatedness in nature, the rolling hills and preponderance of trees that surround the site, obviously intended to imbue the product. Oops, 1 second. Obviously intended to imbue the product with a sense of naturalness and purity. In case you're in doubt, within the booklet is a section entitled Bath Kronthal and its Environs, which describes the springs thus, quote, "When nature scattered its bounties over hill and dale, she certainly dealt with this lovely, unpretentious little spot of ground in no parsimonious manner. The romantic impressions produced by a wild mountain landscape, a park-like vista, with winding paths, avenues, flower beds, and lakes," end quote. As this booklet was intended for the American consumer of bottled water, rather than for a spa visitor, there's no reason for this florid description other than to create a kind of romantic terroir for the water. This connects us back to the idea of nature as medicine. Similarly, in these two advertisements for mineral water from Gerolstein on the left and Friedrichshall on the right, you also see this natural setting integrated into the advertisement, evoking for the consumer not only the romance of the European spa vacation, but also the same natural properties of the water. And finally, we have Hunyadi János, the famous Hungarian mineral water. And here you can barely even see the buildings, with the focus being almost entirely on this lush pastoral scene. This is a tear sheet from a journal advertisement rather than an advertising booklet, so that makes sense. The emphasis is on the product rather than on the high society amenities. And to take us to the end of this section, I have these postcards that were printed as souvenirs of the water cure of Alvignac in southwestern France. These come from the William Helfand collection of pharmaceutical ephemera here at the AIHP. And these really stand as a foil to all the materials I just showed you. So here on the left, we have these people taking the waters. The caption reads, "A cure at Alvignac, what delicious water." And then we have a second postcard demonstrating the famed effects of the Alvignac cure. "A cure at Alvignac, what miraculous effects." So if you'll pardon a bit of scatological humor, the waters at Alvignac were, yes, famed for their laxative effects, and particularly frequented by those looking to lose weight quickly. These postcards were originally part of a larger set of about 5, though we only have these 2 in our collection, and play off this idea to humorous effect. And I include these really to show, a less high-end souvenir. Alvignac never reached the kind of swanky modernity of these other spa towns I showed you. It was a much humbler affair, and perhaps related to all of that, the souvenirs are far more lowbrow than, say, a list of the politicians and royalty expected for the 1910 season. So now we'll get into the evolution of these water cure establishments in America during the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century. These materials represent the moment in America when hydropathy moves from being an intensive cure based around the ethos of the reform movement towards something that is done mostly for the healing powers of rest and relaxation. As the American middle class begins to grow and railroads connect the country, the American water cure turns into the modern spa vacation based on the European spa town model. So we'll begin with Manitou Springs. And Manitou serves as a good starting point for us in our journey, as it represents many of the different elements that are common amongst these various American spa destinations. The resort surrounding these springs was founded in the 1870s and established Manitou as the first resort town in Colorado. So first and foremost, when we're talking about common themes, we should note that this is a site that has sacred meaning to the indigenous peoples of the Western American plains, particularly the Mountain Ute Nation. White settlers in the 19th century noted offerings left at the springs, which were used for healing by local communities and as a meeting place and place of rest for tribes during the winter. As with many of the American resorts, the displacement of local indigenous communities led to conflict over access to these sacred sites, which were unfortunately ultimately resolved by the US government's removal of local tribes to reservations. And you can see here on the right that the settlers actually named 3 of the springs Navajo, Manitou, and Shoshone, presumably to give them an exotic, mystical air to potential customers. It is worth noting that the Navajo or Diné people and Shoshone or Newe people were not the traditional stewards of these springs. The names are complete fabrications. Similarly, Manitou is itself an Algonquian word meaning spirit, which was often used by indigenous tribes in the eastern United States and Canada to describe the animating spirit of hot springs. Presumably, the founders of Manitou, Colorado, intended to evoke established water cures in the American East, which often made mention of Manitou as a concept, while also lending an air of mysticism to their hot springs. This again connects us back to the idea of the curative properties of nature. In contrast to the European context, the American water cure is tied back to indigeneity as a means of underscoring its purity and naturalness. Manitou eventually became known as the Saratoga of the West. I'll get to Saratoga Springs in just a bit, but this idea of comparison as an advertising strategy takes us into our next slide and a discussion of cultural reference in advertising these resorts. So here on the left, we have this excellent cover from a booklet advertising Carlsbad mineral water from the Carlsbad Springs in modern-day Czechia, known locally as Karlovy Vary. You may remember that Karlovy Vary is one of the UNESCO-designated Great Spa Towns of Europe. And indeed, at the time, Karlovy Vary was one of the most famous European water cure establishments, as evidenced by these 2 pieces of ephemera you see here on the right, both of which claim that their respective resort is the Carlsbad of America. These resorts were being marketed to wealthy Americans, and we can read this evocation of Carlsbad as a kind of sophistication, implying that though they may be in Arkansas or South Dakota, they will be afforded all the beauty and luxury of a European spa retreat. So now we'll take a closer look at these 2 imitation Carlsbads. Many of you may have heard of Hot Springs, Arkansas, which is still famous for its hot springs today. As is pretty much always the case, the springs had been used by local indigenous communities for centuries before being identified by white settlers. The resort itself was built during the 1870s and 1880s. And in an interesting piece of trivia, Frederick Law Olmsted was originally intended to do the landscaping of the town, but withdrew following contract disputes. Returning to this idea of the Carlsbad of America, you can see here that we have these wide European-style boulevards for strolling, just like those of Vichy and Vital, that are clearly meant to evoke the European spa town experience. We also have pricing. So returning again to this idea of the hot springs as a luxury vacation spot, we can see that the weekly expenses would have been about $42 to $145 in 1899. Though they're obviously trying to provide a range with the idea that people of different classes could visit hot springs, that's really still prohibitively expensive for most at this time. Though it can be hard to directly translate 19th century wages into 21st century terms, we can say that that would be about $1,500 to $5,200 per week today, which is not insignificant, especially when you consider that many of these folks are staying for multiple weeks or even months. So again, we're looking at a middle to upper class clientele. Another interesting thing to note here under the as a pleasure resort heading is that they write that, quote, the idea that it is only those who are afflicted that come here has long since proven erroneous. So already by 1899, we see this movement away from the water cure as a medical necessity and towards this all-encompassing idea of a pleasure spa vacation with presumably some health benefits on the side. And then finally, I want to draw your attention to the copyright page, which includes the agent information for the Iron Mountain route and the Hot Springs Railroad. So this gives you a sense of the interconnectedness of the expanding rail network across the US and these new resorts. Because many of the hot springs were quite rural, they relied on the availability of new transit links to bring their visitors to them. And this again ties us back to ideas around modernity and the need to escape the grind of modern urban life by going on vacation. Our second Carlsbad of America is Hot Springs, South Dakota, another traditional indigenous sacred site taken over by white settlers. Like Hot Springs, Arkansas, the resort town was constructed mostly in the 1870s and 1880s and was well established by the publication of this advertisement in the 1890s. Again, in the language used and in the imagery, we see this evocation of Europe and of a luxury vacation experience. As in the advertisement from Arkansas, we see that the healing aspect of the springs, although present, has been overshadowed by this idea of the Palace Resort Hotel of the West, which is so up to date as to be heated by steam and lighted by electricity, just as you'll remember the hotel in Val-les-Bains. I also like that they note the fire hose and fire escapes on every floor. I'm sure the historians in the audience know that just about everything seems to have been on fire from about 1870 to 1900. So this was probably a real necessity, especially with all that new electric lighting. And here we also have reduced rates by week or month. So this is not something that you're stopping into en route elsewhere. We see that the resort is the destination, with relaxation amidst the balsamic odors of the great pine forests as the goal. We also have these lines from John Greenleaf Whittier, quote, and the pale health seeker findeth there the wine of life in its pleasant air, end quote. So again, we're returning to this miasmic imagery, the pale city dwellers needing to travel to the resort to find health in the natural cures of fresh air and clean water, while also, of course, conveniently spending a lot of money at the Palace Resort of the West. All right, so we're going to jump ahead about 50 years here from the 1890s up to the 1940s into arguably America's most famous resort town. So if you'll remember, Manitou Springs was advertising itself as the Saratoga of the West in reference to these famous springs. Although we've moved ahead, we should note that Saratoga Springs was actually one of the earliest American water cure establishments, founded around 1802. They are the only naturally carbonated springs east of the Rockies and were, like seemingly all American hot springs, sacred to local indigenous tribes long before being commercialized. Many of you probably know Saratoga Springs for its racetrack, which also fits in with the shifting identity of water cure establishments during this period. So the racetrack in Saratoga Springs opened in 1863, which actually makes it the oldest racetrack in America, followed by the casino in 1870. So this all is very central to the integration of leisure into spas. We're moving away from being left to shiver wrapped in cold, wet blankets toward this more pleasure-based approach of relaxation, fresh air, and amusements. Though obviously you can see here on the left, health still played, some part in attracting customers to the spa. At least for me, colon irrigation is not high on my vacation to-do list. But still by the 1940s, we were solidly in the rest and relaxation age of the spa. So these materials here were sent to the Institute by the spa, and they detail treatments, costs, local medical staff, and the primary conditions that were being treated at the spa during the 1940s. So I know it's a little hard to read here, but essentially most people are coming for rheumatic ailments and heart ailments. And heart ailments actually includes high blood pressure. So to me, this paints an interesting picture because it suggests that although there's still a focus on the medical benefits of the spa, the disorders are much more related to the stresses of daily life and less to, say, a necrotizing skin condition or a debilitating stomach ailment. High blood pressure obviously is associated with stress, and rheumatic ailments could be as benign as the aches and pains of getting older. The narrative of the ills of modernity has carried all the way forward into this latest iteration of the medical spa. And just to further underline this, we'll take a final look at the restoration cure on offer at the Saratoga Spa. The booklet reads, quote, "Primarily, the restoration cure is for those who suffer from no organic disorder, whose health is ordinarily good, but who have been under some unusual physical or nervous strain, or who may just feel run down. To come to the restful natural beauty of Saratoga Spa, to relax in the gentle stimulation of its baths, to follow them with rubs or massage, to drink the zestful waters, to indulge in the sports and other diversions that are afforded, to breathe the tonic air that comes down from the Adirondacks is a delightful and incomparable experience," end quote. And it sounds pretty good to me, right? So to bring this all back around, here's the ultimate kind of endpoint of hydrotherapy. We've moved all the way from the sometimes extreme water cures of the reform movement to this restoration cure, which is basically just getting away from it all, specifically out into the fresh air of the countryside, relaxing and being active. So to finish our time together, I'm just going to take a very brief look at the mineral waters of Wisconsin, as well as the artificial mineral water businesses that sprang up around this industry. Oops. Weird. One moment. Okay. So obviously, I would be remiss if I didn't mention some of the cures from Wisconsin as the home state of our collection. As you can see here, most of the water cures in Wisconsin were lithia water, or mineral water containing lithium salts, which is a relatively rare subgenre of mineral springs. And if lithiated water makes you think of the bell jar, you're actually not far off. Lithiated beverages were popular in the 19th and early 20th century as mood improvers. And in fact, 7-Up originally contained the mood stabilizer lithium citrate from its release in 1929 until 1948. So in Wisconsin, Waukesha is home to the most famous of the Wisconsin mineral springs, first gaining prominence in the 1870s when it began to develop into a resort town. The Waukesha Freeman wrote in 1869 that, quote, "Unbeknown to our people, there has gurgled forth a fount of God's elixir of life, and the afflicted of every country shall look here for a revival of lost hopes. What Saratoga is to the east, Waukesha is ultimately destined to be to the rest of the world, a health-restoring resort for suffering humanity," end quote. So again, we see this referential quality in the advertising, Waukesha as not just the Saratoga of the West, but in fact, the Saratoga of the entire rest of the world. And truly, the cure was actually wildly popular, with even Ulysses S. Grant reportedly stopping into the resort to take the waters. But as was the case with many of these mineral water cures, the Waukesha mineral water craze ended right around 1906, when the Pure Food and Drug Act made it illegal to make claims of unproven health benefits on food and drug labeling. So finally, we get to artificial waters. And in many ways, this final section exists because I just wanted to show off this great cartoon of Hairbreadth Harry. But beyond this, I do want to point out that the success of marketing mineral waters for health inspired a great deal of copycat innovation by pharmaceutical companies, like Eli Lilly here on the left. They tried to create artificial substitutes for the mineral waters being bottled at these different sources. And indeed, one of the Lilly preparations is actually called Carlsbad salt, yet another nod to Karlovy Vary. And we see that there are also Kissingen and Vichy salts on offer, two other great European spa towns. And all of these are meant to offer the same medicinal properties of the water that they are mimicking. But that does not mean that the spas were okay with this appropriation. As we see here, the proprietors of Vichy mineral water warned in their advertising booklet at the Chicago Exposition that artificial mineral water could never replace the water bottled at the source. And I really appreciate this comparison they make between wine and mineral water. However, following the 1906 labeling crackdown, companies were better able to regulate what exactly was going into each bottle by synthesizing the minerals rather than by bottling them directly. This meant that most of the mineral waters bottled at the source began to be marketed as simply beverages rather than as health tonics. And most of the artificial waters involved adding effervescent salts to still table water to create a carbonated therapeutic agent substitute. You can think of, to use the most famous example, Alka-Seltzer. So here in our Hairbreadth Harry cartoon, when Harry's thrown down the well, smother me with onions, Belinda actually runs to the druggist and buys effervescent salts, which she pours down the well, shooting Harry up and out and saving him from the dastardly Rudolph. And so finally, before we open things up to questions, I just wanted to share this quote from Some Like It Hot. I happened to rewatch it when I was first preparing this presentation and had never really clocked this line before. So here we have Tony Curtis on his misappropriated yacht with Marilyn Monroe, and he's telling her, that he's essentially frigid, all of course as a ploy to get her to spend the night with him. He tells her that he's tried everything. Quote, "I spent 6 months in Vienna with Professor Freud, flat on my back. Then there were the Mayo brothers, injections, hypnosis, mineral baths." So even as the water cure moved more and more into the realm of leisure and away from serious medical use, we still see this holdover of the water cure as a mysterious alternative remedy to be tried when nothing else helps. All right, thank you so much. I will leave you with this excerpt from a poem about the magnetic springs of St. Louis, as well as our social media handles. And I will open it up to questions.